Hello, welcome back to my studio. Now, if you want to make your own Christmas cards, but you've seen other tutorials and they look a bit too complicated, I've got a really simple technique to show you today, and you can make all these beautiful Christmas cards, and you honestly, you don't need to have artistic skill to make these. All you need is some cardboard or card blank, some aluminium foil and spray adhesive or tape, inks, paints, paint sticks, and of course some foliage. I pressed a few of these in my flower press just because I have one, but you don't have to do this because the pressure from the foil will actually stick the foliage down onto the card. But if you have a press, or if you've got some time to put some things under a few books just overnight, it makes it a little bit easier. So of course I'm using some holly, and you'll see me using ivy later. I'm using some fir, and then at the end I'm using some rushes, which aren't a traditionally Christmas plant, but they have a sort of starry effect that I thought worked really well. This is adhesive aluminium foil that you can get at builders merchants. I'll put a link to one below. And it's so good because it's a little bit thicker than regular foil, and it's really, really sticky. So you can get around all the edges of the foliage, and that gives you that sort of really lovely crisp relief effect. And then you want to get as much of the relief as possible, so you've got to really press down, and you can use various tools to do this, but I actually found my finger was the best thing. You can use both the sort of pad of your finger and your fingernail, and then because it is so sticky you need to cut off the excess, otherwise it's going to stick to your table while you're doing all the pressing and moulding. And you'll find that the more you do this, the more detail's going to emerge. And it's actually a really satisfying thing to do, because you can even get the individual veins of the leaf to show, and you can smooth out the back and you get a really good effect. Here's another one with some holly leaves that I did, and as you can see I've managed to get all the creases out of this. I did leave, as you can see, there's a tiny bit of the leaf sticking out on the left. I don't really mind this because it shows that you're using real foliage, which I think is quite fun in a card. So I'm just finishing off getting as smooth a surface as I can, and then we'll move on to, it's not really painting, it's more sort of tinting. Because what makes these cards so magical is because you get the glow of the foil coming through the paint. So if you completely obliterated it, you wouldn't get the same effect. And if you used acrylic paint neat, that's what it would do. It would kind of dull down the surface. So I'm actually adding some glazing medium, about kind of half and half, I'd say, in proportion, mixing them together. And then you do get a more translucent effect. But as you'll see with all of these paint methods, I apply the paint and then I wipe some of it off, because I just want a kind of hint of it and nothing too opaque. Because it is such a shiny surface, and it will resist the paint to some extent. So sometimes, it's good. It gives you playtime. So if you put something down and you really don't like it, you can just wipe it off again, and you could probably get it off completely. Or I just quite like giving this sort of slight cloudy effect to the background as well, just so it's not completely shiny silver, but you can still see the lovely glow beneath. I came across this method because I was looking for a way of making a kind of printing plate that I could use with my gel plate. But I think because of the sort of shininess of the surface, it just didn't really work very well. But then I realised, it's rather a sort of beautiful thing in its own right. I am trying again with the gel plate just to see if I can get a sort of diffuse effect, because I hadn't tried it with using the acrylic paint and glazing medium. So I wouldn't say this was a complete success, but I did manage to get some of the paint onto the card. You wouldn't be able to use it to stamp from. It would just be too smeary. But it was a way of getting more paint on. But as you can see, it's just not very it doesn't go on in a very sort of nice way. So I just sort of wiped off the areas I didn't really want it on and kind of blended it in on the leaves, which I quite liked the combination of the green and the rust. And I think I went in again with some more green. And because I've got these margins either side, because the foil doesn't quite reach to the edges, I thought I'd paint them with the two colours that I've used. Now I'm going to show you my favourite way of adding colour to the plate. And here I'm using some ivy leaves, and I was really pleased that this method worked because I've tried so many times to print with ivy leaves and they just don't do very well. They're such a thin leaf and they don't have a lot of detail on them. So when you try and use them with the jelly plate, for instance, you just never get a very good definition. So I was just really pleased how well this works, and it just shows how this method, for the sort of most shallow leaf or anything that you're using, and you can see later that I use some paper shapes, it's such a good method for picking out those details. And I love doing this. I mean, you can see as I sort of slowly, although I speeded it up here, you can see how the sort of leaf comes to life as you make the background recess a bit more. So I'm just cutting off the edges. And one thing I want to say is you do have to be careful of the edges. You can see that I've got a plaster on here because I foolishly used my finger to try and sort of rub down the edge of it, and it was sharp. So don't do that. Do use something like this. I'm using the bone folder here, or any implement. Just don't use your finger to do this part. Look how beautifully that's picked out all those tiny little veins on the leaves that you just wouldn't be able to show if you tried to do a jelly print of it. And these are my favourite inks to use. They're called Caligo Safe Wash. You get them in relief or etching form. I use them interchangeably. I just want it for the colour really. And they're very thick and viscous. They're oil based, but they actually wash up with soap and water. I don't quite know how they do it. And you only need the tiniest amount. And I found just sort of dotting on and then using a bit of cloth or a bit of kitchen towel. Usually I went in with my finger as well. And because they're oil based, they just give the most wonderful glow. So you've got the glow from the foil and you've got the glow from the oils as well. And I think you get really the sort of prettiest effect with these. And they come in various colours and you can intermix them. You can add extra oil to make them thinner. They're a little bit expensive, so I would, if you want to do this, I would just get maybe one or two colours, because you get such a lovely effect that you don't need to have like a whole rainbow, I think. And I'm using a little bit on the background as well. What's sort of left on my piece of paper, I'm just using to just sort of knock back the shininess a little bit. And then in a moment you'll see that I go in with a darker colour as well. I think it was an umber. I just wanted to sort of try and pick out the veins in a slightly different colour to the rest of it. That's just so pretty, isn't it? I just love the way it catches the light and you can pick out every little vein on the leaf. So now I'm using a piece of the fern and I'm placing it on my card and using the adhesive tape in the same way you've seen me do a couple of times now, trimming off the edges of course, and then doing the pressing to get all the little shapes in really nice relief. And this time I'm using these Markal paint sticks. You get different makes. They're based on oil, and again they have that nice sort of translucent effect. If you haven't used them for a while, they can dry up a bit, but you just need to scrape or cut the top off, and then they're nice and soft underneath. And what's good about these is it's a bit like doing a rubbing. They're very good at picking out the relief part of the design, but leaving the background bare. So if you like that look, these might be a good way for you to go. And you do need to leave a couple of days for these to dry completely, as with the other oil-based inks that I've used. They're not that sort of sticky, but just you'd want to wait a couple of days before you put them in an envelope to send to somebody. Now I'm going to show you that if you can't get hold of the adhesive tape, you can just use regular kitchen foil and spray adhesive. And I thought because I've got a bigger piece to work with, I'd do a larger design and then I could cut them up and use them in window cards. And this is just, as you can see, this is just regular aluminium foil. And there are sort of pros and cons to this. The pros are you can get to cover a bigger area, but I think doing it this way, you don't get quite such a crisp effect. So for this, I am using the ivy leaves because I think something thinner would work quite well. You'll see that I do have a bit of an issue with the stems a bit later, but I think I got away with that in the end. And I like the idea that I can use these sort of long tendrily bits because they're just so pretty, aren't they? So any spray adhesive will work. I think this one is a repositional one because it doesn't sort of completely dry straight away. But the important thing is to get as good a cover as possible. And after I've sprayed the foil, I'm spraying it all over the surface as well, just to get as much covered in the glue as possible. I think I probably could have even done a bit more. So it's the same technique really. You just want to get as much contact between the foil and the surface as you can, and I'm using my hands, and I think you'll see me using a sort of squeegee thing as well. And then I just spent a long time trying to pick out all the leaves, and because the stems were quite, well, they weren't really thick, they do stick out quite a bit, and so that did cause me a few problems. And this became my favourite tool, which is just a sort of smudger on the end of a pen that you can use on fabric. And but also finger and fingernail were really good for doing this as well. And I'm trying to get the foil in as close as I can to the stem. And in the end, I decided to, because there just wasn't enough foil, because of the 3D nature, I decided to cut one side of it so that I could press the foil down into that gap, because I really didn't like that. And in a few places the stem came through, but I did just sort of patch it up with some other areas of, I did just patch that up with some other pieces of foil, and that worked really well because once it was painted you didn't really notice it. So I'm going in with my smudger again and just making sure that it's really firmly down, and doing that for the rest of it as well. And for a slightly different effect, I'm using some spray paint just to give a sort of sprinkle of frost. I've just got this sort of off-white acrylic paint in a can, and it's got such a fine spray that I think it gave a nice sort of ethereal effect. And I'm going in again with my favourite Safe Wash inks, and I think I used yes, I mostly used this sort of pale green, but then I decided to try and get a little bit more dimension, and I went in with some blue as well a bit later on. I think you'll see that it's sort of different lighting because it was getting so dark I had to put some lights on. But I think it sort of picked out the detail really nicely. Here I'm using a sort of rubber shaper tool on a stick, and that's just so that I can sort of spread the ink in. I want to make sure it gets right to the edge of the leaves and picks out all those lovely details. And because I'm using it for these window cards, I'm just cutting it to size, and it also means I can sort of cherry pick the best parts that I'm pleased with to actually make the card with. And you can see that I'm using the card just to see which bits are sort of most pleasing for the final result. So once I finished them, I decided to add the blue because I thought they just looked a little bit plain, and that the blue, I'm just putting it at the base of the leaf so that it will kind of give some dimension, and I was really pleased with this effect. And by putting it on with my finger, it's sort of diffusing the colour as well. I really liked that. I knew these rush flower heads would work really well because I'd already made one for my autumn leaves collection. And although they're not traditionally a Christmas plant, I just think they've got this lovely sort of starry quality and that they'd work well. So again, I'm doing it with the regular aluminium foil. And this was, I must say, this was easier than with the ivy because they have much lower profile stalk.